The morning air at the airbase in Japan felt different that day in 1952. Captain Helen Wright stood beside her aircraft, running her hand along the cold metal of the fuselage. The C-47 transport plane wasn't much to look at, but she'd learned to trust it with her life. More importantly, she'd learned to trust it with the lives of wounded soldiers who desperately needed to get home. Helen was 28 years old, though the war had a way of making everyone feel older than their years. She'd grown up in a small farming town in Iowa, the daughter of a crop duster pilot who'd taught her to fly before she could legally drive a car. When the Korean War started, she'd enlisted as a flight nurse, one of the few women allowed to serve in the air. It wasn't the combat role she'd secretly wanted, but she'd take what she could get. The other pilots at the base had their doubts about her at first. A woman flying evacuation missions? Some of them laughed behind her back. Others made jokes about how she should be serving coffee instead of flying planes. But Helen had a way of proving people wrong. She'd flown more missions than most of them, brought back more wounded soldiers, and never once complained about the long hours or dangerous conditions. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Danny Torres, was checking the instrument panel inside the cockpit. Danny was a good kid from Texas, only 23 years old, with a wife and baby daughter back home. He'd been assigned to fly with Helen 6 months ago, and at first he wasn't happy about it. But after their first mission together, dodging anti-aircraft fire while evacuating wounded men from a hot zone, he'd changed his tune. Now he trusted her completely. "Everything looks good up here," Danny called out from the cockpit window. "Fuel tanks are full and I've double-checked all the gauges." Helen nodded and continued her walk around the plane. She checked every rivet, every panel, every tire. Her father had taught her that a good pilot never skips the pre-flight inspection, no matter how many times you've flown the same aircraft. It was a lesson that had saved her life more than once. The Korean War had been raging for 2 years now, and everyone was exhausted. The fighting had settled into a brutal stalemate, with both sides dug in and refusing to give ground. Helen had seen too many young men pass through her aircraft, their bodies broken, their eyes haunted by things they'd never be able to forget. Across the Pacific, on a frozen hilltop in Korea, 540 Marines were going about their morning routine. They'd been holding this position for 3 weeks, a remote outpost that didn't even have a proper name on most maps. The men just called it the Hill, and they'd learned to hate every inch of it. The Marines were tired. They'd been under constant pressure from Chinese forces who seemed to have an endless supply of soldiers. Every night brought probing attacks. Every day brought sniper fire and mortar rounds. The men had learned to sleep with one eye open and to never feel completely safe. Corporal Billy Henderson from Alabama was cleaning his rifle when his sergeant came by. Henderson was 19 years old, fresh-faced despite 3 months in combat. He'd been writing a letter to his mother, trying to explain what the war was like without actually telling her anything that would make her worry. "Intelligence says something big is coming," the sergeant said quietly, so the younger Marines wouldn't overhear. "Chinese are massing forces all along the sector." Henderson looked up from his rifle. "How big are we talking?" "Big enough that they're talking about evacuation protocols. But you know the brass. They'll wait until the last possible second to pull us out." The sergeant moved on to check on other positions, leaving Henderson alone with his thoughts. Evacuation protocols. That meant things were about to get very bad very quickly. Back in Japan, Helen was in the operations briefing room studying weather reports. A massive storm system was moving in from the north, the kind of weather that grounded aircraft and made flying suicidal. The meteorologist pointed at the swirling patterns on the map with concern. "This is going to be a bad one, Captain. Visibility near zero. Winds gusting up to 60 knots, heavy precipitation. Nothing's going to be flying in this for at least 48 hours. Helen nodded, making mental notes. 48 hours was a long time in a war. A lot could happen in 48 hours. A lot of men could die in 48 hours. What's the timeline?" she asked. "Stormfront should hit the peninsula in about 6 hours. We're grounding all aircraft as of 1400 hours today." Helen glanced at her watch. That gave them a narrow window if any emergency calls came in. After that, anyone who needed help would be on their own until the storm passed. The briefing ended and Helen walked back across the tarmac to her aircraft. The wind was already picking up, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. She'd flown in bad weather before, but something about this felt different. Something about today felt like the universe was setting up pieces on a chessboard. arranging circumstances that would test everything she believed about duty and courage. Danny was sitting on the wing of the plane, eating an apple and reading a letter from home. He looked up as Helen approached. "Storm's coming," she said simply. "Yeah, I heard. Looks like we get a day off." Helen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. In her experience, the military never gave you a day off unless something worse was waiting around the corner. On the hilltop in Korea, the Marines could feel it too. That strange tension that comes before a major battle, the kind of quiet that isn't really quiet at all, but rather the held breath before an explosion. Veterans who'd been through it before recognized the signs. The newer Marines just felt uneasy without knowing exactly why. Henderson finished cleaning his rifle and checked his ammunition. He had 4 magazines, each with 30 rounds. He had 2 grenades clipped to his belt. He had a knife his grandfather had carried. In the First World War, he hoped it would be enough for whatever was coming. The Chinese forces, gathering in the hills around the Marine position, were preparing for their largest offensive in months. Thousands of soldiers, all of them ready to overrun the American position. The plan was simple and brutal: attack with overwhelming force, surround the Marines, and eliminate them before reinforcements could arrive. By mid-afternoon, Helen was on standby status. That meant she had to stay close to her aircraft, ready to launch on a moment's notice if an emergency call came in. She sat in the ready room with Danny and the rest of her medical crew, playing cards to pass the time. Nobody was really paying attention to the game. Everyone was watching the clock and glancing at the phone on the wall. The storm hit right on schedule. Rain began hammering the roof of the ready room. Wind rattled the windows. Helen stood up and walked to the window, staring out at her aircraft being buffeted by the wind. In this weather, flying would be almost impossible. Almost. The phone rang at 18:43 hours. Everyone in the room froze. Helen was the first to move, picking up the receiver before the second ring. "Captain Wright," she said. The voice on the other end was tense, speaking quickly. As Helen listened, her expression changed from alert to grave. Danny watched her face and felt his stomach drop. This was bad. This was very bad. Helen hung up the phone and turned to face her crew. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She was making calculations in her head, weighing impossible odds against unthinkable alternatives. 540 Marines, she finally said, surrounded and under attack. They need immediate evacuation or they're not going to make it through the night. Danny stood up slowly. "In this weather?" Helen looked out the window at the storm, then back at her crew. "In this weather," she confirmed. "Command is grounding all aircraft," one of the medical technicians said. "They're calling it too dangerous." Helen was quiet for a long moment. She thought about those 540 Marines, young men just like Danny, just like her younger brother who was serving somewhere in Korea. She thought about their families back home, waiting for letters that might never come. She thought about the oath she'd taken as a medical officer, the promise to do no harm and to help those in need. She thought about what her father would do in this situation. Then she made her decision. The hilltop erupted in chaos just as darkness fell. The Chinese attack came from 3 sides at once, waves of soldiers charging through the storm toward the Marine positions. The sound of gunfire mixed with thunder, creating a nightmare symphony that Henderson would never forget. He pressed himself against the frozen earth, firing controlled bursts at the shadows moving through the rain. Beside him, his friend Tommy from New Jersey was doing the same, both of them trying not to think about how badly outnumbered they were. "They just keep coming," Tommy shouted over the noise. Henderson didn't answer. He was too busy changing magazines, his fingers numb from the cold. The Chinese forces seemed endless, replacing every fallen soldier with 2 more. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with your bare hands. The Marine commander, a grizzled major from Kentucky, was on the radio trying to coordinate with headquarters. The news wasn't good. The storm had grounded all aircraft. No reinforcements were coming. No supplies were being dropped. They were completely on their own. "We need air support," the major shouted into the radio. "We need medevac. We've got wounded men dying out here." The voice on the other end was apologetic but firm. Nothing could fly in this weather. They would have to hold until the storm passed. The major threw the radio handset down in frustration. Hold until the storm passed. They'd all be dead by then. Back at the airbase in Japan, Helen was already moving toward her aircraft. Danny ran after her, along with the rest of the medical crew. Rain soaked them instantly, the wind nearly knocking them off their feet. "Helen, wait." Danny caught up to her at the plane. Command said no flights. "This is suicide." She turned to face him, rain streaming down her face. "Those are our boys out there, Danny. They're dying while we stand here talking about regulations." "But the storm." "I know about the storm. I know what Command said. But I also know that 540 Marines are going to die tonight if someone doesn't help them." She paused, looking him directly in the eyes. "I'm going." "You don't have to come with me." Danny looked at the aircraft, then at the storm, then back at Helen. He thought about his wife and baby daughter back in Texas. He thought about the promise he'd made to come home safe. Then he thought about those Marines trapped on that hilltop, and he made his choice. "You'll need a co-pilot," he said simply. Helen smiled, the first genuine smile in days. "Yeah, I will." The medical crew climbed aboard without hesitation. They'd flown with Helen long enough to trust her judgment completely. If she said they were going, then they were going. It was that simple. Helen started the pre-flight checklist, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the urgency. Danny was in the co-pilot seat going through his own checks. Behind them, the medical team was securing equipment and supplies, preparing for the wounded they hoped to bring back. From the control tower, the operations officer spotted their plane starting to move. He grabbed his radio. "Angel of Mercy, this is Tower. You are not cleared for takeoff. Repeat, you are not cleared for takeoff. All aircraft are grounded by direct order." Helen picked up the radio mic. Her voice was calm and steady. "Tower, this is Angel of Mercy. I understand the order, but there are 540 Marines who need help right now. I'm taking full responsibility for this decision. Captain Wright, if you take off, you'll be facing a court-martial for disobeying direct orders." Helen looked out at the storm, then at Danny, then keyed the mic one more time. "I'll take my chances with the court-martial. Those Marines don't have any chances left at all." She switched off the radio before the tower could respond and pushed the throttles forward. The C-47 began rolling down the runway, picking up speed despite the howling wind trying to push it sideways. In the tower, officers watched in disbelief as the plane lifted off into the storm and disappeared into the darkness. Some of them were angry at the blatant insubordination. Others were quietly impressed by the courage it took to fly into that weather. All of them doubted they would ever see that aircraft or its crew again. The flight was worse than anything Helen had experienced in her entire career. The plane was thrown around like a toy, climbing and dropping hundreds of feet in seconds. Ice formed on the wings, adding dangerous weight and affecting the aircraft's ability to fly. Visibility was absolutely zero. She was flying entirely on instruments, trusting her training and her instincts to keep them alive. Danny was calling out readings from the gauges, his voice tight with tension. "Altitude 1,400 feet. Airspeed 120. We're drifting right, coming back to heading." Lightning flashed nearby, so close that Helen could smell the ozone. The plane shuddered as turbulence hit them again. In the back, one of the medical technicians was getting sick, but there was nothing anyone could do about it. Helen's arms ached from fighting the controls. Every muscle in her body was tense, constantly making tiny adjustments to keep the plane level. She'd been flying for less than 20 minutes and it felt like hours. "How much farther?" Danny asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Helen checked their position on the map. "About 40 minutes at this speed. If the wind doesn't slow us down more." 40 minutes. It seemed like an eternity. On the hilltop, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Marines were being pushed back, their defensive perimeter shrinking with each passing minute. Wounded men were being dragged to a makeshift aid station, where a Navy corpsman was working miracles with limited supplies. Henderson had taken shrapnel in his left arm, but he barely noticed. He was too busy firing at the Chinese soldiers who kept coming through the rain and darkness. His rifle was so hot from constant firing that steam rose from the barrel every time Rain touched it. "Fall back to secondary positions," the major ordered. "Fighting retreat. Keep it organized." The Marines fell back in good order, covering each other, carrying their wounded. They'd been trained for this, but training was different from reality. In training, you didn't have bullets cracking past your head. In training, your friends didn't die beside you. Tommy went down hard, hit in the chest. Henderson grabbed him and dragged him toward the aid station, zigzagging through enemy fire. Tommy was trying to say something, but Henderson couldn't hear him over the noise. "Save it," Henderson shouted. You're going to be fine. Doc's gonna patch you up. But Henderson had seen enough combat to recognize a fatal wound. Tommy probably wouldn't last the hour, let alone survive long enough for any kind of evacuation. The corpsman at the aid station took one look at Tommy and shook his head slightly. There were too many wounded, too few supplies, and no way to evacuate anyone. He was having to make terrible choices about who to treat and who was beyond help. Do something, Henderson pleaded. I'm sorry, son. I've got to focus on the ones I can save. Henderson held Tommy's hand as his friend's breathing became more labored. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They were supposed to go home together, supposed to get married and have kids and tell war stories over beers when they were old men. The major was back on the radio, his voice hoarse from shouting orders all night. Command, we need that medevac now. I've got over 100 wounded, and that number is climbing by the minute. If we don't get these men out of here, they're all going to die. Sir, no aircraft can fly in these conditions. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to hold your position until the storm clears. We can't hold. We're almost out of ammunition. We're being overrun. There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. When the voice came back, it was quiet and sad. Then God help you, Major, you're on your own. The major set down the radio handset slowly. He looked around at his men, these young Marines who'd followed him into hell without question. He'd led them here, and now he was going to watch them die. The thought was almost more than he could bear. Then one of the men shouted something that sounded like aircraft. The major thought the kid was hallucinating. Nobody could fly in this weather. But then he heard it too, the distinctive sound of engines somewhere above them in the darkness. Is that what I think it is? Someone asked. The major grabbed his binoculars, but visibility was so poor he couldn't see anything. The sound was growing louder, though unmistakable now. A plane was approaching their position. Someone was actually crazy enough to fly in this storm. Get those flares lit, the major ordered. Mark the landing zone, move. Marines scrambled to light flares and set up makeshift runway lights using whatever they could find. Vehicle headlights, flashlights, burning debris, anything that would help guide the aircraft in. The Chinese forces, realizing what was happening, intensified their attack, trying to prevent the evacuation. Helen saw the flares through the rain and darkness, tiny points of light that marked her destination. She began her descent, fighting the wind that wanted to slam her plane into the ground. This was going to be the most dangerous landing of her life, and she'd made some pretty dangerous landings before. Gear down, she ordered. Danny lowered the landing gear. I hope that runway is long enough. It'll be long enough, Helen said with more confidence than she felt. It has to be. The C-47 dropped out of the storm like a rock, the wheels hitting the muddy makeshift runway hard. The plane bounced, skidded sideways, and for a terrifying moment Helen thought they were going to flip over. But she wrestled the controls, straightened them out, and Helen threw open the aircraft door and jumped down into the mud. Rain hammered her face as she took in the scene around her. The hilltop was chaos. Explosions lit up the darkness. Tracer rounds streaked through the air like deadly fireflies. And everywhere, wounded Marines were lying in the mud, waiting for help that they'd given up hope of receiving. The major ran up to her, his face a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. Who the hell are you? Captain Helen Wright. I'm here to get your men out. The major stared at her for a moment, taking in the fact that this pilot who'd just performed an impossible landing was a woman. Then he decided he didn't care if she was a trained circus bear, as long as she could fly them out of this nightmare. We've got over 100 wounded, Captain, some of them critical. Helen surveyed the wounded Marines being carried toward her plane. Her medical training kicked in immediately, and she began making rapid assessments. Bring me the worst cases first. Critical injuries get priority. We'll take as many as we can fit. Danny and the medical crew were already setting up inside the aircraft, preparing to receive casualties. The Navy corpsman who'd been treating the wounded ran over to coordinate with Helen's team. I've got 15 men who won't survive another hour without surgery, the corpsman said, his voice shaking with exhaustion and stress. Another 20 who need immediate attention. After that, it's mostly shrapnel wounds and broken bones. Helen nodded, already doing calculations in her head. The C-47 was designed to carry maybe 30 passengers in normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. We'll take 70 on this trip. Danny's eyes went wide. 70? Helen, we can't possibly... We're taking 70, she repeated firmly. I don't care if they're stacked like cordwood. We're not leaving anyone behind who needs immediate help. The loading began immediately. Wounded Marines were carried aboard, some on stretchers, others supported by their friends. Helen stood at the door directing traffic, making instant decisions about who would fly and who would have to wait for the next trip. Henderson helped carry Tommy toward the plane. His friend was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Helen took one look and gestured them aboard immediately. "Get him in the back on the left side. My team will start working on him right away." Henderson laid Tommy down as gently as he could, then started to climb back out of the plane. One of the medical technicians grabbed his arm. "You're wounded too. You should stay." Henderson looked at the blood-soaked bandage on his arm, then shook his head. "There are guys worse off than me. I'll catch the next plane." But he didn't know if there would be a next plane. Nobody did. The plane filled quickly with broken bodies and desperate men. The smell of blood and mud and fear filled the aircraft. Helen's medical crew moved among them, starting IVs, applying pressure to wounds, doing whatever they could to keep the most critical cases alive long enough to reach a hospital. All around them, the battle continued. Chinese forces were closing in. Realizing that the Americans were trying to evacuate, mortar rounds began falling near the landing strip, sending up geysers of mud and shrapnel. "We need to go," Danny shouted from the cockpit. "They're zeroing in on us." Helen made one more check of the loaded aircraft. Every inch of floor space was filled with wounded men. Some were sitting, others lying down, a few standing in whatever space they could find. It was dangerously overcrowded, far beyond any safety regulation. The plane would be sluggish and difficult to control with this much weight. But looking at the faces of these young Marines, some of them barely old enough to shave, Helen knew she couldn't leave a single one behind if there was any way to take them. "Close it up," she ordered. "We're taking off." She climbed into the pilot's seat, her clothes soaked with rain and blood. Danny was already running through the pre-flight checklist, though there wasn't really time for it. They needed to get airborne before a mortar round turned them into scrap metal. Helen pushed the throttles forward. The overloaded plane began rolling down the muddy runway, sluggish and heavy. It picked up speed slowly, too slowly. The end of the runway was coming up fast, and they weren't going fast enough to lift off. "Come on," Helen whispered to the aircraft. "Come on, girl. You can do this." Danny was watching the airspeed indicator, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his seat. "We're not going to make it." "We're too heavy." "Yes, we are," Helen said through gritted teeth. She pulled back on the controls, willing the plane into the air through sheer force of determination. The C-47 lifted off with maybe 10 feet of runway to spare, immediately buffeted by the wind. For a terrifying moment, the plane seemed to hang in the air, neither climbing nor falling. Then the engines caught hold, and they began a slow, painful climb into the storm. A mortar round exploded right where they'd been seconds before. The major watched the plane disappear into the darkness and rain, carrying 70 of his men. He said a quick prayer that they'd make it, then turned back to the battle. He still had over 400 men to protect. The flight back was even worse than the flight in. The overloaded plane handled like a truck with a broken steering wheel. Every gust of wind pushed them around like a leaf. Helen's arms felt like they were going to fall off from fighting the controls. Behind her, in the cargo area, the medical crew was performing miracles. They were doing emergency surgery in the middle of a storm, with the plane bouncing around with limited light and supplies. One of the medics was holding a flashlight while another was trying to clamp a bleeding artery in a Marine's leg. Tommy was fading fast. The medical technician working on him looked at Helen and shook his head. There was nothing more they could do. Henderson's friend would never see home again, never see his family, never get the chance to live the life he'd dreamed about. But the technician kept working anyway, kept trying to make Tommy as comfortable as possible, kept holding his hand so he wouldn't die alone. That was all they could do now. The storm seemed to sense that the plane was struggling, and it intensified its assault. Lightning struck so close that the plane's instruments went haywire for a moment. The aircraft dropped 500 feet in an air pocket, and Helen had to use every bit of her skill to prevent them from going into a spin. "Altitude," Danny shouted. "We're too low." Helen pulled back on the controls, coaxing the overloaded plane to climb. Every foot of altitude was a battle. The plane wanted to fall, wanted to give up, but Helen wouldn't let it. In the back, men were praying, some out loud, some silently. A few were crying. They'd survived the battle only to possibly die in this storm. It seemed cruelly unfair, but Helen didn't believe in fair. She believed in skill and determination and refusing to give up. She'd gotten this far, saved these men from that hilltop, and she'd be damned if she was going to let a storm take them now. How much farther? She asked Danny, her voice tight with strain. Danny checked the instruments, trying to calculate their position. Maybe 20 minutes. If we can stay in the air that long, 20 minutes. It seemed like forever. Back at the airbase, the operations officer had been watching the radar, tracking the small blip that represented Helen's plane. Other officers had gathered around, watching in tense silence. Nobody believed she could actually pull this off. The weather was too bad, the plane too overloaded, the whole mission too impossible. But the blip kept moving, slowly making its way across the radar screen toward home. She's still flying, someone said quietly, almost in disbelief. She won't make it, another officer replied. That plane is going to break apart in this storm. The operations officer didn't say anything. He just watched the radar, silently willing that blip to keep moving. On the hilltop, the Marines were still fighting. But now they had something they hadn't had before. Hope. Someone had come for them. Someone had made it through the impossible storm. That meant more planes might come. That meant they might actually survive this nightmare. Henderson was back at his position, firing at Chinese soldiers who kept charging through the darkness. But now he was fighting with renewed determination. He'd put Tommy on that plane. If more planes came, more of his friends would survive. He just had to hold on a little longer. The major was on the radio again, reporting to headquarters. Command, a C-47 just took out 70 of my wounded. Request additional aircraft for evacuation. There was stunned silence on the other end of the radio. Say again? Did you say a C-47 just took off from your position? Affirmative. Female pilot captain didn't catch her full name. She landed in this storm and took out our most critical casualties. More silence. Then, Major, all aircraft are grounded. No one is authorized to fly in these conditions. Well, someone didn't get that message, Command. And thank God they didn't, because without that evacuation, those men would be dead by morning. The radio conversation ended, but the news spread quickly through the command structure. A pilot had disobeyed direct orders and flown into the storm. Officers were divided on how to react. Some called for immediate court-martial. Others called her a hero. But everyone agreed on one thing. If she somehow made it back alive, she'd just done something that would be talked about for years to come. Helen didn't know about any of that. She was too busy trying to keep her plane in the air. Her world had narrowed down to the instruments in front of her, the controls. Medical teams swarmed the aircraft before the engines even stopped. Ambulances lined up along the runway, their red lights flashing in the rain. Doctors and nurses rushed aboard, beginning triage even as the wounded Marines were still being unloaded. Helen sat in the pilot's seat, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She'd done it. She'd actually done it, but there was no time to celebrate or even rest. There were still 470 Marines trapped on that hilltop, and the night was far from over. Danny touched her shoulder gently. Helen, we need to refuel, and you need to rest, even if just for a few minutes. She shook her head. No time, those men are still fighting. Every minute we wait, more of them die. You're exhausted. We all are. If you try to fly back there right now, you'll make a mistake and we'll crash. Then we can't help anybody. Helen knew he was right, but every instinct screamed at her to get back in the air immediately. She compromised. 15 minutes. We refuel, I grab some coffee, and we go back. As they climbed out of the aircraft, a colonel came striding across the tarmac, his face red with anger. Helen recognized him as the base commander, and she knew exactly what was coming. Captain Wright, he barked. You are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, unauthorized use of military aircraft, and reckless endangerment. Helen stood at attention, rain still pouring down on her. Yes, sir. I understand, sir. You deliberately violated a direct order from this command. Yes, sir, I did. The colonel seemed momentarily thrown by her complete honesty. Do you have any idea how serious this is? You could be court-martialed. You could go to prison. Sir, with respect, 540 Marines are about to die on that hilltop. I don't care about regulations or court-martials. I care about bringing those men home. Behind the colonel, some of the wounded Marines who were still conscious had gathered to watch the confrontation. They'd heard what the colonel said, and they understood what Helen had risked to save them. One of them, a sergeant with his arm in a sling, spoke up. Sir, that pilot saved my life. She flew through hell to get us out of there. The colonel turned, seeing the wounded Marines for the first time. His anger faltered as he looked at their faces. These young men who'd been given up for dead just hours before. Another Marine, this one on a stretcher, added weakly, "There's more men still up there, sir. They need her." The colonel looked from the Marines to Helen, then back again. He was a career officer, a man who believed in rules and regulations and proper procedure. But he was also a man who'd been a young Marine once, who'd seen combat, who understood what it meant to be left behind. He made his decision. "Captain Wright, consider yourself confined to your aircraft. You are not to leave that plane under any circumstances. Is that clear?" Helen blinked, confused. That sounded like punishment, but something in the colonel's eyes told her it wasn't. "Sir, I don't understand." "I said you're confined to your aircraft, Captain. If you happen to fly that aircraft back to evacuate more Marines, well, I can't very well stop you if you're confined to your plane, can I?" He turned and walked away before she could respond, calling back over his shoulder, "And Captain? Godspeed." Helen stood there for a moment, stunned. Then she smiled and turned to Danny. "You heard the man. I'm confined to my aircraft. Better get the refueling done fast." The ground crew worked at record speed, pumping fuel into the C-47 while the medical team cleaned out the cargo area as best they could. There was blood everywhere, medical supplies scattered around, but there was no time for a thorough cleaning. They just cleared enough space to load more wounded. Helen gulped down hot coffee, letting the caffeine work its magic. Her arms still ached from fighting the controls, but she pushed the pain aside. Pain was temporary. Death was permanent. Captain Wright, a young private, approached nervously. "My brother is up on that hill. Bobby Chen, he's with Charlie Company. If you see him..." Helen put a hand on the private's shoulder. "I'll bring him home. I'll bring all of them home." The private nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Within 15 minutes, the plane was refueled and ready. Helen and Danny climbed back into the cockpit, and the medical crew took their positions in back. They'd all signed up for this knowing the risks. They'd all decided that some things were worth dying for. Helen started the engines and taxied back to the runway. The storm hadn't let up at all. If anything, it seemed worse than before, but Helen didn't hesitate. She pushed the throttles forward and lifted off into the darkness once again. The second flight was a repeat of the first, but knowing what to expect didn't make it any easier. The storm battered the plane mercilessly. Ice formed on the wings again. Lightning flashed around them, but Helen kept flying, kept fighting, kept refusing to give up. On the hilltop, the Marines had been listening for the sound of engines, hoping desperately for another plane. When they heard Helen's C-47 approaching, a cheer went up from the positions. "She came back," someone shouted. "That crazy pilot came back." The major felt a wave of relief wash over him. He'd seen a lot of brave things in his career, but this pilot's courage was something extraordinary. She hadn't just made one impossible flight. She was making a second one. The landing was just as terrifying as the first time. The makeshift runway was even muddier now, torn up by the previous landing and ongoing mortar fire. But Helen brought the plane down safely, if not smoothly, and once again the loading began. This time Helen knew exactly what she was doing. She moved among the wounded with calm efficiency, directing the loading, making split-second decisions about priority cases. 70 more Marines were packed into the aircraft, some sitting, some standing, some lying on stretchers stacked too high. Henderson was helping load casualties again when he spotted his buddy from basic training, Bobby Chen. Bobby had taken shrapnel in the leg and couldn't walk. "Bobby. Hey, over here." Bobby's face lit up when he saw Henderson. "Hank, man, I thought you were dead." "Takes more than a few Chinese soldiers to kill me," Henderson joked, though his voice shook. "Come on, let's get you on that plane." Henderson carried Bobby toward the aircraft. As they approached, Helen saw them and pointed to a spot near the door. "Your brother is waiting for you at the base," she told Bobby. "Private Chen, right?" Bobby's eyes widened. "David, you saw David? I promised him I'd bring you home. Let's keep that promise." As Bobby was loaded aboard, Henderson started to turn away, but Helen grabbed his arm. "You're getting on this plane, too. That wound is infected. You need proper medical treatment, but I can still fight. That's an order, Marine. Get on the plane." Henderson wanted to argue, but the look in Helen's eyes told him it wouldn't do any good. Besides, he was exhausted. He'd been fighting for days, and the wound in his arm hurt more than he wanted to admit. Maybe it was time to accept help. He climbed aboard and found a spot on the floor next to Bobby. Around them, other wounded Marines were packed in tight. It was uncomfortable, undignified, and absolutely beautiful. They were going home. Helen took off again, the overloaded plane struggling into the air. The flight back was just as brutal as before. But now Helen had a rhythm. She knew this plane, knew this storm, knew exactly what she could push and what she couldn't. She landed safely at the airbase, unloaded her 70 passengers, and immediately began preparing for another flight. The ground crew tried to convince her to rest, but she refused. There were still 370 Marines on that hilltop. The colonel came back as she was refueling. "Captain, you've already made 2 flights in impossible conditions. You've saved 140 men. No one could ask for more than that. I'm not doing this because someone asked, sir. I'm doing it because those men deserve to come home. The storm is getting worse. The weather report says wind speeds are increasing. Then I better hurry." The colonel studied her face, seeing the determination there. "How many more flights are you planning to make?" Helen did the math in her head. "As many as it takes, sir. All of them. Every single Marine on that hill is coming home tonight. That could be 6 or 7 more flights. Maybe more. Then that's how many I'll make." The colonel shook his head in amazement. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the craziest." Helen smiled. "Can I be both?" She took off again before anyone could stop her. Flight number 3, then 4, then 5. Each time she loaded the maximum number of Marines the plane could possibly carry. Each time she flew through the storm that was supposedly too dangerous to fly in. Each time she brought them home safely. Word spread through the airbase about what was happening. Off-duty personnel came out to watch. Pilots who'd initially scoffed at Helen's first flight now stood in silent respect, knowing they couldn't do what she was doing. Mechanics worked frantically to keep the plane airworthy between flights, patching bullet holes and checking systems. Other pilots, inspired by Helen's courage, began attempting flights as well. 2 other C-47s managed to make it through the storm, carrying additional wounded, but Helen made more trips than anyone. Flying long after exhaustion should have grounded her. On her 6th flight, the plane took a direct hit from ground fire. A bullet punched through the fuselage and shattered one of the instruments. Hydraulic fluid began leaking. Danny reported that the damage was serious. "We need to turn back." Dawn was beginning to break as Helen prepared for her 8th flight. She'd been flying for over 12 hours straight, making trip after trip through the worst storm anyone had seen in years. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, her hands raw from gripping the controls, but she refused to stop. Danny was worried about her. He'd seen pilots push themselves too far before, and it never ended well. But he also knew there was no way to convince Helen to stop, not while there were still Marines on that hilltop. "How many are left?" she asked the major over the radio. "About 60, Captain. The Chinese forces have pulled back with the daylight. We've managed to stabilize the situation here, but these men still need medical attention." 60. Just 60 more. Helen could do this. She could make 2 more flights and bring every single Marine home. The thought gave her a burst of energy, pushing back the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. The mechanics had worked a miracle. The plane wasn't exactly as good as new, but it was airworthy. Barely. They'd patched the bullet holes, rigged a temporary fix for the hydraulics, and said a prayer. That would have to be enough. Helen took off into the storm one more time. But something was different now. The first hints of dawn were showing through the clouds, and the storm was finally beginning to weaken. Visibility was still poor, but it was better than it had been all night. Small mercies. The landing at the hilltop was almost routine now. Almost. Helen had made this approach so many times that her body seemed to know what to do without her brain having to think about it. The plane touched down, and immediately the remaining Marines began loading. But this time was different. These weren't critical casualties. These were the men who'd stayed behind to hold the perimeter, to protect their wounded brothers while the evacuations took place. These were the fighters who'd faced down an overwhelming enemy force all night long. The major was among them. He'd insisted on being the last man off the hill, staying with his Marines until everyone else was safe. As he climbed aboard Helen's plane, he took a long look at her face. "You look like hell, Captain." Helen managed a tired smile. "You should see the other guy, sir. What you did here tonight. There aren't words for it. You saved 540 lives. Just doing my job, Major." "No," he said firmly. This was way beyond any job. This was something else entirely. Helen didn't argue. She was too tired to argue. She just wanted to get these last Marines home safely, and then sleep for about 3 days straight. The flight back was the easiest one yet. The storm was definitely weakening, and with the lighter load, the plane handled much better. Helen almost allowed herself to relax, but years of flying had taught her to never relax until the wheels were safely on the ground. As they approached the airbase, Danny pointed out the window. Look at that. The entire base had turned out to watch them land. Hundreds of people lined the runway, personnel from every unit on the base. When Helen's plane touched down and rolled to a stop, they began to cheer. Helen sat in the cockpit listening to the sound of applause and cheering, and felt tears start to run down her face. She was too tired to stop them, too emotionally drained to care. She'd done it. Against all odds, breaking every rule, risking everything, she'd brought all 540 Marines home. Danny put his hand on her shoulder. Come on, time to face the music. Helen climbed out of the plane on shaky legs. Her medical crew was right behind her, looking just as exhausted. They'd all been through hell together, and they'd all come out the other side. The colonel was waiting for her, but this time he wasn't angry. He stood at attention and saluted. Helen, surprised, automatically returned the salute. Captain Wright, he said formally, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and the United States Air Force, I thank you for your service tonight. You have brought honor to your uniform and saved American lives through courage and skill beyond measure. Helen didn't know what to say. She'd expected to be arrested, court-martialed, maybe even dishonorably discharged. Instead, she was being honored. The major from the hilltop stepped forward. Behind him stood as many of the Marines as could walk, some still bandaged, some on crutches, all of them alive because of what she'd done. 3 cheers for Captain Wright, the major called out. Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! The sound echoed across the airbase, 540 voices raised in gratitude and respect. Helen felt her knees go weak. Danny caught her before she fell. Easy there. You need to get some rest. I need to file my flight reports, Helen mumbled, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. The flight reports can wait. Come on. They helped her to the medical building, where a doctor examined her and declared that she was suffering from severe exhaustion, but was otherwise fine. She was ordered to bed rest for at least 24 hours. Helen slept for 36 hours straight. When she finally woke up, she found her room filled with cards and letters from the Marines she'd saved, from their families, from people all over the base who'd heard what she'd done. But there was also an official letter waiting for her. Helen opened it with trembling hands, expecting it to be court-martial papers. Instead, it was a commendation. She was being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors a pilot could receive. The letter praised her extraordinary heroism and skill. In the face of impossible conditions, her selfless dedication to saving American lives, and her courage beyond the call of duty. Helen read the letter 3 times, hardly believing it was real. She'd broken the rules, disobeyed direct orders, and risked her career. But in doing so, she'd saved 540 lives. Apparently, that mattered more than the regulations she'd violated. Over the following weeks, the story of what Helen did that night spread throughout the military. Newspapers picked it up. Radio programs told the tale. She became something of a celebrity, though she hated the attention. She'd just done what needed to be done, what any good pilot and medical officer would have done. The formal ceremony for her Distinguished Flying Cross was held 2 months later. All 540 Marines she'd saved were invited. Not all of them could make it, but hundreds showed up in their dress uniforms, standing at attention as the medal was pinned to Helen's chest. In her acceptance speech, Helen was brief and to the point. I didn't do this for medals or recognition. I did it because those men needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Every one of them would have done the same for me. That's what service means. Henderson was in the audience that day. His arm had healed well, and he was being sent home to Alabama in a few weeks. After the ceremony, he approached Helen. Captain Wright, I wanted to thank you personally. My friend Tommy didn't make it, but I did. Because of you, I get to go home to my family. Helen shook his hand. I'm sorry about your friend. So am I, but you gave him a chance. You gave all of us a chance. That's more than we had before you showed up. Bobby Chen was there too, reunited with his brother David. Both of them thanked Helen. Their words simple, but heartfelt. She'd given them their lives back. As the years passed, the story of that night took on legendary status. Military historians wrote about it. Flight schools taught it as an example of courage and skill under impossible conditions. The C-47 she'd flown, the Angel of Mercy, was eventually retired and placed in a museum, where it stands today as a testament to what one person can accomplish when they refuse to accept the impossible. Helen continued flying for several more years before eventually retiring from active service. She married Danny and they had 3 children. She rarely talked about that night in Korea, finding it uncomfortable to be seen as a hero. She'd just done her job, she always said. Anyone would have done the same. But that wasn't true, and everyone knew it. Not anyone would have flown into that storm. Not anyone would have made 8 trips through hell to save lives. Not anyone would have broken every rule and risked everything for people they'd never met. Helen Wright did those things because she believed that every life mattered, that rules existed to serve people and not the other way around, and that courage meant doing the right thing even when it was terrifying. 30 years after that night, a reunion was held for the Marines she'd saved. By then, they were middle-aged men with families of their own, children and grandchildren who existed because Helen had brought them home. They gathered to honor her, to tell their stories, to make sure that what she'd done would never be forgotten. Henderson was there, now a grandfather himself. He stood up to speak, his voice shaking with emotion. I was 19 years old on that hilltop. We were all sure we were going to die. And then we heard the sound of that plane coming through the storm, and we knew someone was crazy enough to try to save us. Captain Wright didn't just save our lives that night. She saved our futures. She saved our families. My grandchildren are here today because of her courage. Around the room, other Marines nodded, many of them wiping tears from their eyes. Their children and grandchildren looked at Helen with wonder, trying to imagine this elderly woman performing such an incredible feat. Helen stood up to address them, leaning on a cane now, her hair white, her hands showing the tremors of age, but her eyes were still sharp, still determined. I look around this room, she said, and I see 540 reasons why.